Hi, hello drag experts, it is me, your least favorite Drag Race content creator, Jer. We are talking about something a little bit different today, something I've been holding on to in the back of my wig for a couple of weeks now. I always say that Drag Race is a TV show before it's a competition, and with that in mind, sometimes there are stories that producers will pursue that we as the audience are consuming and eating our popcorn, but they don't always make sense. And then there are sometimes things that will get teed up, but won't actually go anywhere. And we're gonna talk about a couple of those today in no particular order. But first, let's give an example of a storyline that did go somewhere and had a good payoff. Alyssa and Coco are the perfect example of storylines that were set up from episode 1 that had a through line through the entire season, resolving in Coco sending Alyssa home. We as the audience get to parasocially interact with them, participate in their life story, and watch as that story unfolds on camera. This is kind of a lost art form in television. Sometimes storylines will get queued up, but then the queens themselves won't actually pursue them because they just don't want to open themselves up for any scrutiny from the audiences. They don't want to allow us to get involved, and so they observer effect themselves, neuter their presence on camera, and don't allow anything more to happen. But sometimes it's production's fault. Sometimes queens will open up about things like Brooke and Vanjie and will allow us to parasocially observe them, flirt, and have a showmance. And then producers will follow through with that storyline and seemingly abandon something that is much bigger and more present in the workroom that's been bubbling, that has more drama and more stakes. And then we as the audience are left wondering about that storyline after the show. Because reality TV has primed us to understand these are characters and they're playing a role. So since I've already mentioned Brooke and Vanjie, now Vanjie is the center point of the very first story that went nowhere that I want to talk about today. Vani and Eevee had tension all season 11. It got particularly bad in the design challenge, and there was this friction between the two of them where they were not seeing eye to eye. Eevee was coming off abrasive, Vanjie was coming off abrasive, and they were fighting non-stop. They would stop and patch things up, but then things would get rocky again and they would get back onto the wrong foot. This tension continued through the remainder of the season and never quite got resolved. When we get to the magic show episode, we see this tension be almost at its height. They are about to explode at each other, and you can feel the red hot energy in the workroom. You can see it develop in the challenge, and you see it unfold on the runway. Vanjie's prime beef was with Eevee, but yet Sugarcane got tossed into the bottom, even though Suga was a part of the winning group that episode. And Vanjie was tossed in the bottom, rightfully so, but it was the perfect opportunity to have Vanjie and Eevee go against each other for the ultimate battle a la Coco and Alyssa. Granted, the stakes were a little bit less because Coco and Alyssa's drama happened before the show, where Eevee and Vanjie's drama happened on the show. Regardless, it was the moment to put them together and let them duke it out, because we never got resolved to that storyline. When Vanjie finally does go home, it's at the hands of Brooklyn Heights, who by that point, they had started to avoid each other in the workroom and not really bring up their showmance because I think they noticed that it was eclipsing their performance in the competition. When Suga did go home, the lip sync that night was no more drama. And Suga had no friction with anyone in the workroom, but Vanjie and Eevee did. With them both performing not so great in the challenge and with them both performing not incredibly on the runway, it made more sense to put the two of them there. However, I think producers didn't want to lose Vanjie or Eevee. They were their main players. And Suga was the most sacrificable character because Brooke and Nina both excelled in the challenge, and Akira and Silky were endgame. So production-wise, it made the most sense to sacrifice Suga, but television-wise, we had no resolve to the Vanjie Eevee storyline on the show. It got loosely addressed during the reunion, but unlike the Coco Alyssa scenario, we never get a nice bow tie off. As the audience, our characters that we're observing don't get to have that final battle moment. And I think some of the most effective storylines in Drag Race are those final battle moments. Think about Jeremy and Alyssa in All Stars 2, where Jeremy had been absolutely going in on Alyssa and Alyssa wins that Shut Up and Drive lip sync and gets to send home Jeremy. That's excellent TV, and it's always on when producers opt to ignore a storyline that's sitting right in front of them and sacrifice it for something that's a lot more low stakes. Second storyline that went nowhere, Ellie versus Lawrence. Through the series of UK2, Ellie and Lawrence were fairly close with each other. They were always relying on each other as the two Scots in the room to bounce ideas off of each other, to work together in challenges. I think Lawrence saw herself as more of an older sister to someone like Ellie, and Ellie saw Lawrence as not just an older sister, but kind of as an equal. Ellie was always comparing herself and her progress in the show to how Rue was treating Lawrence. That moment where Rue comes to the two of them to discuss the challenge, and Ellie asks, "Why don't you say my name like that?" Because Ellie was craving Rue to notice her the way that she noticed Lawrence. Throughout the season, Ellie had been pretty congenial, hadn't really ever talked back or sassed Lawrence in any way, but then we get to the comedy challenge where Ellie finally stops being nice. Ellie breaks every bit of congeniality that she had left in her and intentionally tries to sabotage the entire room. And Lawrence takes that specifically as a personal attack. Lawrence blows up, hair flying everywhere, looking like an angry cat with their tail fluffed up. Lawrence is yelling at Ellie, telling her to just stick to her guns if she's gonna play shady boots. And Ellie gets backed into a corner and apologizes very severely to Lawrence for trying to harm her trajectory in the competition. But that doesn't stop Lawrence from berating her again and again and again. This storyline had been building up with Ellie looking up and admiring Lawrence to wanting to be better than her, to finally having an opportunity to do so. And when we get to the actual challenge itself, Lawrence flubbed. Lawrence was incredibly unfunny during her set, and Ellie was just as bad. There was a lot of conversation about what to do with Ahura, because she went into the really raunchy, disgusting sexual route with her set. But Ellie had done just as raunchy, but did it with a weird voice that came off slightly immature. And producers opted to go for a romance story in the same way that they did with Brooke and Vanjie. This storyline of Tayce and Ahura started very early in the series with Lawrence calling out that maybe they've hooked up before. And when they came back from the break, they teased that maybe something happened, but they kind of avoided each other for the rest of the series. They tried not to intermingle, they tried their best to stay away from each other so that there wouldn't be rumors, because they didn't want to pursue that storyline on TV. It wasn't a part of their narrative, Gia. And yet, producers opted to allow that storyline to flesh out in the roast about love and sexuality. And since the two of them had not pursued that storyline, it was an ungratifying final lip sync between them. There was notably more friction between Ellie and Ahura that episode. They had fought the hardest. And if they already knew they were gonna send home Ahura, they could have put Ellie there, sent Ahura away, and then in BeastEnders, had Ellie and Lawrence battle it out one last time and then Ellie goes home. This, in my opinion, was horribly mismanaged in the same way that Eevee and Vanjie were. With that tension in the workroom, there was no excuse to not follow through on that storyline. And yet, they did nothing with it. When there was a justifiable reason to put Ellie and Lawrence in the bottom for their performance in the challenge and on the runway. And before anyone says that Lawrence looked great, yes she did, but the original challenge prompt was dripping in diamonds. And it was last minute switched to stone on the runway, which is why all the rest of the contestants were in diamond palettes, where Lawrence was in rose quartz. I do wonder if producers changed that prompt last minute so that Lawrence could be saved from the bottom, because if it was still dripping in diamonds, Lawrence absolutely had every possibility of falling into the bottom too, for missing the mark on the challenge. They could have maintained that original prompt and put Lawrence and Ellie there, sent home Ellie, and then had a bow tie on that drama between them, with Ellie getting her karma for trying to screw over someone who had been kind to her all season. Finally, number 3, Anita versus Kita. This happened in Down Under Season 1. Now in episode 1, Kita and Anita's big storyline was that not only were they co-workers, but they also were business partners. Anita has this moment in a confessional where she says, "I don't know how Kita would fare if she went home. I don't know how our friendship would be if she went home and I stayed." And they make a pretty big deal about how the two of them are there. how they're very close with each other. And Anita goes home during the design challenge. Kind of unfairly in my opinion, because there were worse looks on that runway. But there was, again, a completely justifiable reason to put Kita in the bottom, considering that look was hot, messy garbage, and could have had that big lip sync moment that we had been building up to in the workroom since episode 1. That their dynamic was so close, who would be the stronger of the two of them, but we never get that resolve. And then Anita is not referenced through the entire rest of the competition by Kita. It's almost as if that storyline started, died on the producer desk, and never went anywhere. The TLDR of every one of these scenarios is that when something happens on a producer's desk and they decide what is going to be pursued on the show, and they give that to the other producers and they look at all of these scenarios that are possible and say, okay, we have these storylines going on, who do we want to punish and who do we want to reward so that we could further our narrative to get to the end? They will take routes, sometimes giant leaps, in order to put people in the bottom so that they will lip sync against someone that they have tension with. Sometimes they will do something justifiable, like putting Tamisha and Candy in the bottom together after their giant blow up, and they'll just see what happens. But then other times, the producers will completely ignore a storyline. In television, if you decide to take a path, you usually support that path in the editing. We know that Coco and Alyssa are gonna have a big duel at some point, because every single time the editors get a chance to show Coco or Alyssa talking about each other, they give that to us. Anytime that they talk to each other or bicker in the workroom, they show that to us. They don't take time away from that storyline to focus on something that might be happening with Jade or Lanesha or whoever else in the workroom. Season 5 is a really great example of good storytelling on the producer desk to what we as the audience are actually consuming in the final product. And so with all of these scenarios that I've mentioned in this video, these are moments where producers decided to not utilize the storylines that were happening naturally in the workroom. But yet, when it got to the editor's desk, they decided to keep some of these storylines, when it would have made more sense in Drag Race Down Under to focus more on Kita's progress in the show and not have her be a background character. If her storyline was never going to be intermixed with Anita, it should have been a quick one and done editing moment where Anita brings it up, Kita talks about it, and then it's never brought into the final edit ever again. In regards to Ellie and Lawrence, for that storyline, while that blow up may have been huge in the workroom, more focus in the editing should have been on Ahura and Taste so that we get a final resolve of why they're in the bottom and have to battle it out, and why that's high stakes. Not just because Ahura is a big player and Taste is a big player, and we as the audience are going to be scared about losing one or the other. And in the case of Vanjie versus Eevee, a lot of that fluff of them fighting could have been cut down to focus more on tension that other players in the game had with each other. Because again, Drag Race is a TV show before it's a competition. The people on the ground, as it's happening, know what they're doing, and they focus on various elements of the competition to focus on high and low placements. And that needs to translate into the final edit, and it doesn't always. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know some of your favorite plots from the franchise. I would love to do a video where I react to all of y'all's favorite plot lines in the entire franchise, even international seasons. I am down to talk about them. So let me know what your favorite one was. If I had to put my definitive #1 favorite storyline, it would be Alyssa and Coco. That is the ultimate storyline in Drag Race. But also I have to mention Mother Melinda versus the judges, because that's also a really incredible storyline that happened in Canada 4. Thank you again for watching, and I will see y'all on the flip. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to click that like button. And if you want to see more, hit subscribe. Goodbye.